I'm Dr. Paul Houle, and I will guide you through this issue of our Radon Continuing Education program. Now, this issue is going to deal with the new, relatively new, Home Buyers and Sellers Guide that the EPA published in the middle of 1993. This guide is what will be disseminated to the public as the days go by, and as its title states, it's for the home buyers and the home sellers. As you're already aware, the overwhelming majority of radon tests that are performed in real estate transactions. And so this guide focuses quite closely on that particular activity. Also within this guide is a hint, in fact a statement as to what the new protocols are for doing radon testing. So for those who are watching this program and are certified radon testers, then you will need to be made aware, and I will do that for you, as to the new testing protocol that impacts you directly. So let's begin with the Home Buyers and Sellers Guide to Radon. The first thing that you should note, and if you follow along in these visuals as you see here, is that the EPA recommends that if you're planning on buying or selling, to have it tested. And obviously that simply makes sense. Numerous sales agreements which I've been made aware of have been either delayed or in fact terminated because radon tests were done late, or were done improperly, or the concentrations came out high. If you do the test early, then certainly that's better off for the sales agreement. So that's the first thing that you see here. For new homes, you should ask if the radon-resistant construction has been included. We know, for example, in a new home construction that you can put most of a subslab mitigation system in for on the order of $100 prior to construction or during construction, such that if radon does turn out to be a problem, for just another $100 or so, we can plug in the rest of the mitigation system and eliminate the radon problem in a home. So the home buyers are being told that if you're looking at a new house to buy, that ask if radon mitigation systems have been plugged into the construction phase. And of course, the third item that we see here on this visual is to fix the home if the concentration is greater than or equal to 4 picocuries per liter. Well, we've all seen that dozens of times, so that's not a surprising issue for us. The guide goes on to tell us, and many of these things we've already seen, so I can go through them relatively quickly. Radon has been found in homes all over the U.S. That is absolutely correct. 1 out of every 15 homes in the United States is expected to have a radon problem. That is a concentration greater than 4. And we're aware that in Pennsylvania, at least our own studies here at East Stroudsburg University, have shown that it's larger than 1 out of every 15, at least in Pennsylvania. Going on, of course, the EPA and the Surgeon General recommend testing your home. That's a smart move. Now, we get to the issues at hand, which the first one is if you're selling, that is, you're the seller, and your home has already been tested. That is, you've paid attention to this problem, you've already had a test performed. What other things should you be doing? Well, you see here, you should make sure the test was properly performed. And you'll see a checklist, which is the crux of this entire pamphlet coming up here in a few visuals. Make sure the test was properly performed. We'll define what that means in the checklist. And provide your test results to the buyer, obviously. You want to give them your test results. Now the buyer, for the buyer, these are some of the options that the buyer has. Of course, the buyer, prior to the sales agreement, can make use of any option he or she so chooses. But these are some that are delineated within this pamphlet. One is to see if the checklist items were not met. And again, we're going to look at that checklist in a minute. But the buyer may ask for a new test if the checklist items were not met. They may ask for a new test if any renovations or alterations occurred since the test was made. Alterations and renovations can change the pathways for radon to enter a home, and so that's an important concern. And they may also ask for a new test if the buyer plans to live in a lower level of the house than you do. Your test, if the test was done on the first floor, for example, and the buyer intends to finish the basement, make a rec room or whatever down in the basement, then it would be important for them to know what the radon concentration is in the basement as well. In that case, they may require a new test. Fundamentally, most buyers will protect themselves by requiring a new radon test, and I'm sure we've all seen that. If you're selling the home, now let's consider the case where you're selling the home and the home has not been tested, and that's what we have on this visual here. You're the seller, your home has not been tested. Clearly the wise move is to test as soon as possible. And where should the test be done? It should be done in the lowest space suitable for occupancy and finished, which means if you have an unfinished basement that you're not occupying, therefore it's not suitable for occupancy, then you don't do the test in the basement, you would do it in the first floor, for example. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. If you're buying a home and the home has been tested, then the buyer may accept the previous test. That's obviously one possibility. The buyer may ask the seller to do another test, or the buyer may arrange for a new test. Principally, the third category here is the one that we see overwhelmingly most of the time. The buyer will typically arrange for a new test. He has a current objective measurement made that way. If you decide to accept the seller's test, now this visual is directed towards the buyer. If you decide to accept the seller's test, you should make sure that it was done in accordance with the checklist. Well, I've referred to that several times, and we're going to get to that very shortly. But make sure it's done properly. Make sure you get the results. Amazingly enough, it is possible to ask, has the radon test been done? The answer to which is yes. And that's the end of the story. Well, you've got to look at what the results of the test were in order to know whether or not a radon problem exists in that particular home. Also, where was the test done? That's important to know. Obviously, if the tests were done on the first floor and you intend to use the basement, that is motivation for doing another test in the basement area. You'd also want to make sure the test wasn't done on the second floor, for example, if in fact the first floor is perfectly livable space as it is customarily. So you want to check where it was done. You also want to check what alterations have occurred since the test was done. Any alterations that can impact the foundation, the slab, anything below grade in the property has the opportunity to impact the pathways to radon entering the home. And so if there's been significant alterations, then the radon concentration could change in the home. I can imagine, for example, putting in a whole house fan, if that's been done since a radon test was performed. Let me go back on that for just a second and say, suppose you were looking at a house and the concentration was tested and found to be 1 picocurie per liter. Since that time, a whole house fan has been on that depressurizes the house and vents outside. In that case, I would say a radon measurement needs to be made again, simply because that has a big impact on the pathways for radon getting into the house. That depressurizes the house, allowing the radon to get in more easily. So that would require, in my mind, another test. And of course, this pamphlet directs the buyer to pay attention to that. Very transparently here on this next visual, if you are buying and the home has not been tested, well, for gosh sakes, test as soon as possible. That seems quite obvious to me. Now, the pamphlet on the Home Buyers and Sellers Guide also reflects on the sales agreement, what the pamphlet calls the contract. In a sales agreement, you can put down any number of contingencies as the buyer. That is, you'll buy the house assuming that the following conditions are met. And one of the conditions can be that a radon test be performed and that the concentration come out below a certain value. That can be a contingency placed in a sales agreement. And I have seen it many times placed that way. If we take a look at what kinds of things should we consider in that sales agreement contingency, consider including in this contract who will conduct the test. You want to make sure that whoever's going to conduct the test is EPA listed, or in Pennsylvania, they need to be DER certified, and they should have evidence to that effect. What type of test will be done? Will it be a short-term test, a long-term test? Will the carbon canisters be used, EPERMs, charcoal vials, etc.? What kind of test will be done? When will the test be done? Will it be started on Monday at 10 a.m. and then completed on Thursday at 2 p.m., for example? When? That should be specified. Who pays for that test? Typically, in sales agreements, almost all of the tests that are performed are generally paid for by the buyer and not the seller. That is fairly typical, although not to preclude you're having a very motivated seller who would be willing to contribute to some of these expenses. And that's not enough, because once you've decided on all these things, you should also have in the contingency what steps to take if the mitigation is required. Suppose you do the measurement and the concentration comes out to be 10 picocuries per liter. Well, what steps do we take now to establish a proper mitigation? Is the buyer required to put the mitigation system in, or is the seller required to put the mitigation system in? Or in fact, shall we simply put some money in escrow so that the sale can continue moving forward, and then if a mitigation system is necessary, that escrow money is put towards the mitigation? These are all different avenues that can be taken by the buyer. And there are probably others as well which would be helpful to the buyer, and whatever the buyer thinks of, he's free to put into that into the sales agreement prior to signing it. And one other thing on that particular list is where the measurement should be made. We saw there was who will conduct the test, what type of test, when to do the test, who pays. Also, we should ask ourselves, where in the house will the test be made? Okay, and we're going to talk about that too in just a minute. If you're buying a new home, you should ask, and we've actually reflected on this already for a moment, should ask if radon-resistant construction practices have been used. That is, again, has the beginnings of a subslab mitigation system been put into the house? That's a very attractive feature because it doesn't get in the way of the house or in the use of the house. It's cheap and easy to put in during the construction phase. And if no radon ever occurs, you'll never even be aware that that mitigation system is in place. And if you do have a radon problem, then you can activate the mitigation system with relative ease. So that's something that the buyer should be looking for. Now, one of the concerns in the radon industry has been radon tampering, that is, tampering with the measurement. Now, the new term that's being applied to that is interference. And the point that's being made to the buyers and the sellers, and frankly to whoever is making tests, is that is, we want to minimize any interference. We'd like to have a perfect test, which of course is physically impossible. I know of no test that cannot be deceived in some way. Nevertheless, there are steps we can take to help minimize interference. And as we see here on this particular visual, you can get some devices that have an hourly printout, for example, continuous radon gas monitors or continuous working level monitors. Some devices that have motion detectors can tell if the device has been moved. One thing that could be done, I suppose, is you pick up the instrument and you put it outside. Well, that's the outside radon concentration is going to be relatively low, and then move back into the house prior to the home tester coming to pick up the results. So some devices have an ability to detect whether they've been moved. Other devices have an ability to detect if anybody has approached the instrument, proximity detectors. Still others have the ability to record the atmospheric pressure in the building, the temperature in the building, all of which give hints to whether or not some tampering or some interference with the measurement has occurred. You can go further still, since measurements need to be done principally in closed house conditions, at least short-term measurements under closed house conditions. One thing that can be done is the taping of windows. You can get these small seals which can be put on the windows so that if the window is opened, the seal breaks. They're very fragile seals. And you can tell if windows have been opened during the measurement period from that. And that would require, of course, sealing every single window. That doesn't preclude the homeowner, of course, from going in and out of the door. You got to leave them a door to get in and out of the house. But it does, I think, work in a direction of minimizing interference. These are some of the things that the Home Buyers and Sellers Guide mentions. One of the things, one further thing, though, that can be considered is a non-interference agreement. If you've watched our earlier continuing ed programs, we did have some individuals who talked about radon tampering, and one of the things used was a non-interference agreement. Simply a document that explains to the occupant of the home how the test is supposed to occur, that is, under closed house conditions, minimizing ventilation in the house, etc., and that they will not interfere with that they will try to support closed house conditions. And then you get the occupant to sign that form. I think that's a very powerful method of minimizing interference. Another thing that I have seen done, or at least heard has been done, is that a tester will go in the house and go with the occupant and say, now I'm placing, maybe they're putting out charcoal canisters, I'm placing my detector now right here in this location, please don't tamper with it. Have them sign the non-interference agreement, for example, and do whatever steps the tester wants to do. Then the tester goes about doing some other things, and when the occupant is not looking, the tester puts a second detector in the same room. And if there's a big difference between the two detectors, then that might indicate some interference with the measurement itself. So that's one thing I've heard of that has not, that particular last one was not mentioned in the Home Buyers and Sellers Guide. It's a rather clever one, actually. The home buyers and sellers, and this information is old hat to those of us who have been doing radon testing, is the detector categories. And you see here very simply there are two types, passive and active. Passive detectors require no power to operate. Active detectors require power to operate. I have some passive ones here with which we're familiar, the charcoal canister, EPIRM units, Alpha Trax units here. All passive systems require no power. You really just deploy it into the building, set it up and leave it. And charcoal vials as well. Active systems, of course, require power or battery pack generally, and they can monitor the radon on an hourly basis, print out a result, etc. Fundamentally, though, we have two kinds of systems, active and passive detector systems. How long should the measurement be made? And that brings us to the deployment period. And you see here on this visual, long-term measurements are anything greater than 90 days, not 90 days, but greater than 90 days. And for those, Alpha Trax and EPIRMs will, I believe, be the measurement technique of choice. Charcoal vials and charcoal canisters or carbon canisters are not viable for more than, say, approximately 10 days. But Alpha Trax and EPIRMs can be used for longer periods than that. And short-term measurements, as you see here, and this is where the protocol for testing has been changed. Now, for short-term measurements, and these are the measurements that occur most frequently, we see here that short-term measurements are any measurement made for 90 days or fewer. And before we get into these next couple of comments here, let me just point out that in real estate transactions where the time line for doing these kinds of measurement is fairly short, generally the measurements are made for 2, 3, and 4, and 5 days, sometimes 6 and 7 days. Of course, the longer the measurement, the closer you are to the annual average. And it's the annual average of 4 picocuries per liter that the EPA has established as the action limit. We also know, of course, that no short-term measurement is recommended, and that the EPA protocol requires that the short-term measurements be at least 48 hours. And again, the longer the better. I don't mean to suggest that no short-term measurement is recommended, but the measurement must be at least 48 hours or longer. No grab sampling is currently permitted by EPA protocols for purposes of deciding on whether or not mitigation should occur. Now, this is the change that I think we all need to be aware of, and that now the EPA protocols call for 2 simultaneous or 2 consecutive measurements to be done for every measurement. This means that when you go into a home in the past, what you've done is you've deployed 1 detector, perhaps. I mean, you were allowed to certainly do that, put it in the appropriate place, go back and get it after a few days. Now you're required to put 2 detectors in the home side by side. In other words, what we used to call duplicate measurements is now the protocol. We will do duplicate measurements all the time. That is the new EPA protocol. And you may do them either simultaneously, that is, you go down on a given day, put them both down, a few days later go back and get them, pick them both up. Or you can do them consecutively. That is, put one today, go back a few days later, pick that one up and put a second one in, and then go back a few days later and pick that one up again. In other words, go to the house 3 times to deploy the detectors. I don't think that's going to happen very much. You're going to see predominantly simultaneous measurements. And what do we do with those results? Now, you see here that if the average of the two is greater than or equal to 4 picocuries per liter, the EPA recommends fixing the problem. If you're using an active system, such as a continuous working level monitor, etc., then you leave it in for 48 hours, you only put in 1 instrument, and if that gives you an average concentration of greater than or equal to 4, again, the recommendation is to mitigate. Now, for those of you who have the text in front of you, as you should have, in the next few pages is a greater detail on what to do with these 2 values. Fundamentally, you take the 2 values you get, you take the average of the 2, and you report that to the homeowner. But there are some complications to that. And those complications I am explaining within the next couple of pages. So what I would like you to do in just a second is to stop the video, read through the next couple of pages, answer the few questions that are there to get those complications sorted out in your mind, and then return to the video at this point. So I'd like you to do that now. I hope that you found the information clear enough and that the questions were not too difficult to answer. The questions were put there to help make concrete to you the concepts involved on those few pages. In any case, if you weren't already aware, the answers to those questions you can find in the back of the text. I want to continue on with the Home Buyers and Sellers Guide then, and the issue of detector placement. In the guide, detector placement points out that for short-term tests, you need to have closed house conditions, and that if the test is fewer than 4 days, that closed house conditions should be established 12 hours before the measurement is begun. Also, do not do a measurement during storms or high winds. Now, we don't have complete control over that, but if you are fully aware that there's a cold front moving in and that there are storms and high winds associated with it, for example, the recommendation is not to perform the test during that time. We know that high winds via Bernoulli's principle can increase the radon concentrations in a home, and storms, of course, typically bring low pressure areas with them. The detector should be placed 20 inches above the floor, at least 20 inches above the floor, put in a place where it will be undisturbed and away from high temperatures, drafts, and also exterior walls which can support ghost drafts, for example. Continuing on with the detector placement, we have where precisely it should be placed in the lowest level suitable for occupancy. That is, currently lived in or lower if usable without renovations. Now here there's a little room for judgment call, I think, and the tester has to make this judgment. If you have a basement, for example, that is unfinished, it is not being used, then that is not currently lived in, and if it's not usable without some renovation, then the test need not be done in that location. Now, we're going to get into the checklist. And this is, again, the crux of this pamphlet. And for testers who are out there relatively busy, you should be working with a checklist that you can identify closed house conditions were met, etc., 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 so that you have a nice, clear record of what kinds of activities you performed and what the conditions of the home were. A checklist is a good idea. It gives you a good paper trail and helps to confirm that the test is being done in a proper fashion. Here's the checklist that the EPA has in the Home Buyers and Sellers Guide. Give occupants this pamphlet and explain the proper testing procedure. So you should have a stash of these pamphlets with you, and you should give them to the occupants. If there's no occupant in the house, I don't see anything wrong with leaving it on the kitchen counter, on the kitchen table. Try to get it to the occupant as best you can. Use a listed measurement device. Well, of course, in Pennsylvania, that's not a problem because the only devices that are legally permitted are those that are listed. So that's something the tester can check. They recommend also to hire an EPA listed or state certified individual. Now the recommendation here is not necessarily to hire someone. The Home Buyers and Sellers Guide also states that the occupant or the owner, for example, can do the test themselves. I don't think that's going to impact the industry in a significant way because the majority of measurements are done in real estate transactions, and I think the home buyer, who is going to motivate the measurement generally, is going to want an objective test. And for that, I think, as we have seen, they're going to choose home inspectors to do these kinds of measurements. And that inspector needs to be EPA listed, or if the state has a certification program, as we do in Pennsylvania, then they should be certified by the Commonwealth. Now, home buyers and sellers can get a list of those people who are certified by calling the Pennsylvania DER, and the number I'm going to tell you is 1-800-23-RADON. 1-800-23-RADON. And if you're interested in getting this pamphlet, for example, the Home Buyers and Sellers Guide, you can call that number and they'll send it to you, and they can also send to you the list of certified individuals. The checklist continues on. Do what you can to prevent or detect interference, as you see here. Prevent or detect interference. Now the checklist goes on for a couple more pages here. If there is a mitigation system, and if the test period is to be done for fewer than 4 days, you see here, run the mitigation system for 24 hours prior to the measurement under those conditions. Now, if there's an occupant in the home, the mitigation system should be running. It ought to be running already all the time. But if for some reason the building has been vacated and the power shut off, then, and a mitigation system is in place, then that mitigation system should be running 24 hours prior to the measurement being performed. If the measurement is less than 1 week in length, maintain closed house conditions during the measurement. And if the measurement is shorter than 4 days in length, closed house conditions should be established 12 hours prior to the measurement beginning. We've seen that before. That has not changed in any significant way over the past year or two. Continuing on with the checklist, those are things you should do that we've just looked at before the test. During the test, you see here, maintain closed house conditions for short-term tests. Operate heating and cooling normally. You don't have much choice there. If you're in the dead of winter, you've got to have the heating system on. And allow mitigation systems to work. Okay, so I think those things are fairly transparent. What do you do after the test? After the measurement has been made, if the results indicate a mitigation system should be done, fix it. Obviously, fix the problem. And also, review the paperwork, as you see here on this visual, review the paperwork and the testing conditions. Make sure that you can confirm that the measurement was done in a proper way. Now, to give some perception, or some perspective rather, to the levels of concentration, the guide also indicates to the buyers and sellers that the average outdoor level is 0.4 picocuries per liter outside. Average indoor levels run around 1.3 picocuries per liter. That's on the average. And mitigation systems can sometimes get the concentrations down below 2 picocuries per liter. That's not particularly unusual. Many mitigation systems I've seen have gotten concentrations down below 2 picocuries per liter. Now, there are some considerations to be made, to be mentioned regarding short-term measurements. Remember, a short-term measurement is not a perfect indicator of what a long-term average value is for radon in the house. That is, if you get a radon concentration of 10 in the house over a 3-day measurement, does that mean it's 10 in the house over the year? And the answer to that is probably not. Some of the short-term considerations are these. Now, these are considerations to think about when measurements that are made are short-term. Look at this. If the average concentration is close to 4, let's say 4.1 picocuries per liter, there's a 50-50 chance that the year-round level will be less than 4 picocuries per liter. That is less than the action limit. So even though a short-term measurement may come out slightly above the action limit, the annual average may come out to be less. In fact, there's a 50-50 chance that it will come out to be less than 4 picocuries per liter. In a case like that, the sales agreement might be framed in such a way as to have a long-term measurement done, $1,500, let's say, put into escrow, and if the long-term measurement indicates that the concentration is greater than 4, that $1,500 is put towards the mitigation system, and if not, the $1,500 is returned to the seller. Still, as you will note, no level is considered safe. No level of radon concentration is considered safe. So even if you have a concentration of just under 4, that does not mean that there is no health hazard to you any longer. We currently subscribe to the notion that there is no limit below which radon is safe. You'd like to eliminate it to as low as you can get it. 4 is simply the action limit established by the EPA. The radon risk charts that we've seen in other pamphlets is also included in the Home Buyers and Sellers Guide, and I've excerpted just a couple of pieces of data from there. And you see here that for a non-smoker, if you're in a concentration of 4 picocuries per liter, you have a chance of coming down with a lung cancer of 2 out of 1,000, which is the same as the risk of drowning, to give you some measure of what these concentrations indicate. If you're a smoker, the complication is much greater. The same concentration gives you a roughly 15-fold chance of coming down with a lung cancer than if you were a non-smoker, 29 out of 1,000, which is 100 times the risk of dying in a plane crash. So that's just to give some idea of what these health risks actually are. The guide also points out what we've seen in the radon reduction pamphlets, that is that high radon concentrations can be reduced. That's not a big problem. They can be reduced, and outside of a few peculiar homes that are difficult to mitigate, the average cost runs around $1,200, and the range of costs is anywhere between $500 and $2,500. Again, the mitigation system of choice outside of unusual homes is sub-slab mitigation. That average cost you see of $1,200 does seem to be dropping. It has dropped in the last few years, and I expect it will drop a little bit more, although not a lot more. For home buyers and sellers, one other pamphlet that would be of great use is the Consumer's Guide to Radon Reduction, which would explain many of the concerns of how mitigation is performed. And that's very useful. And again, you can get that from the Pennsylvania, at least in Pennsylvania, from the 1-800-23-RADON phone number. The guide has only a few more items to cover here. The guide recommends test after mitigation. If you do a mitigation, that does not guarantee that the radon concentration has gone down unless you test to see if in fact the radon concentration has dropped. Now, there are protocols that dictate to mitigators what must be done, and in Pennsylvania certainly the mitigator is required to do or have done a radon measurement no sooner than 24 hours after a mitigation job is completed and no later than 30 days after a mitigation job has been completed. The key is after the mitigation system is in place and running, wait a few days, let some equilibriums occur, and then do another test to see if the mitigation system is working properly. The guide does help in selecting a contractor. It points out that you should choose someone who is listed in the RCP program, that's the EPA's Radon Contractor Proficiency Program, and that person will carry a photo ID card, and that's how you can identify that that person has taken part in the RCP program. That's a federal program, of course. And almost the last item is the issue of radon in water, which is becoming a more contemporary issue. And for radon in water, the recommendation in this guide is to test if the following conditions are met. You have a radon in air concentration that's a problem, that is greater than 4, and if you're on a well also. So we don't expect much radon in water from reservoirs or large public water supplies, but we do expect them from wells. So if you have a radon in air concentration that's above 4, you should consider, and you're on a well, you should also consider testing your water for radon. The charges for radon in water measurements are roughly the same as radon in air measurements. They are not significantly different. Now, the upshot to the entire pamphlet, then, I can summarize in one little statement here. As you see, simply test and mitigate. You should test, make sure the test is done properly, and then if it indicates so, you should mitigate the problem as quickly as you can. Fundamentally, you want to be careful when you do the measurements. Make sure that they follow the protocols. Make sure they follow the checklist in this guide. And establish good paperwork habits. If you have good paperwork, that's some indication that you've done the test carefully as well. And that ends this issue of this year's Radon Continuing Education. Thank you.